The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the mist hanging over Fort Bragg when the formation began. 200 cadets stood motionless on the parade ground, their boots planted in perfect alignment, their spines rigid, their eyes locked forward. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself knew something terrible was about to unfold. At the center of the formation, isolated like a piece on a chessboard, stood Captain Sienna Blackwell. She was 31 years old, though her face carried the kind of weathering that came from years spent in places where comfort didn't exist. Her uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every button polished. Her posture was flawless, her shoulders back, her chin level. She didn't fidget. She didn't shift her weight. She simply stood breathing steadily, her green eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the formation. 10 feet in front of her sat a steel table. On its surface lay the symbols of her authority arranged with ceremonial precision. Rank insignia, commendation ribbons, military identification, service records. They gleamed in the weak morning light like artifacts in a museum waiting to be cataloged and forgotten. Colonel Garrett Voss circled the formation slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set in a hard line. He was 58, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his close-cropped hair. He'd served in the Gulf War, led men through sandstorms and artillery fire, earned medals that hung in a shadow box in his office. He was a man accustomed to respect, accustomed to obedience, accustomed to being right. And he hated Sienna Blackwell with a passion that had been building for 6 months. The cadets didn't know why. They'd heard rumors, of course. Whispers in the mess hall, speculation during late-night barracks conversations. Some said she'd embarrassed him during a tactical exercise. Others claimed she'd refused his advances after a staff dinner. A few believed she'd gone over his head on a disciplinary matter, challenging his judgment in front of senior officers. The truth was simpler and more pathetic than any of them guessed. Sienna had told him no. Not to anything inappropriate, not to anything that would warrant official complaint. She'd simply declined his suggestions, his recommendations, his guidance on how she should conduct herself as one of the few female officers on the base. She'd done it politely, professionally, without raising her voice or showing disrespect. But she'd done it consistently, firmly, and with a quiet certainty that made Voss feel small. He couldn't tolerate feeling small. "Captain Blackwell," Voss said, his voice carrying easily across the silent formation. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You have demonstrated repeated failures to follow the procedural command structure of this installation." Sienna didn't react. Her face remained perfectly neutral, her breathing unchanged. She'd been trained for this, trained for situations far worse than public humiliation. Her mind cataloged details automatically. Wind speed and direction, temperature, the position of guards at the perimeter, the way several junior officers standing behind Voss wouldn't meet her eyes, the slight tremor in the colonel's left hand. Fear always left traces. Most people never noticed them. She did. "You have," Voss continued, turning slightly so his voice would reach every cadet in the formation, "acted independently on matters requiring approval. You have made judgment calls beyond your authority. You have demonstrated a pattern of insubordination that cannot be tolerated in a military institution." The words sounded official, carefully chosen, the kind of language that would look proper in a formal reprimand. But there was a tightness in Voss's throat, a tension in his shoulders that betrayed something personal beneath the professional veneer. "Effective immediately," Voss announced, his voice rising slightly. "Your rank is revoked." A murmur rippled through the formation like wind through tall grass. It was crushed almost instantly by a sharp order from a senior NCO, but the damage was done. The silence that followed felt brittle, fragile, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Sienna stood perfectly still. Inside her mind, memories flickered like slides in an old projector. Dark rooms with no windows and walls that absorbed sound. Mission briefings delivered without names, without maps, without any official record of their existence. Decisions made in seconds where hesitation meant lives lost, where success was measured by disasters that never happened and heroes who were never acknowledged. She'd operated in places where recognition didn't exist, where medals were a security risk and promotions were a cover story. She'd made calls that generals would spend months agonizing over, and she'd made them while lying prone in sand that burned like coals, while bullets cracked overhead, while men who wanted her dead searched buildings 50 feet away. The rank she wore at Fort Bragg had always been temporary, a convenient fiction, a mask she put on for an assignment that required her to blend in, to seem ordinary, to become just another officer going through the motions. Colonel Voss didn't know that. Nobody on this base knew that. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. Voss reached toward the table and lifted her rank insignia. He held them up, letting morning light catch the metal, making sure every cadet could see. The gesture was theatrical, meant to emphasize his authority to drive home the lesson he thought he was teaching. "You're nothing now," he said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate, almost cruel. "Without these, without the structure, without the system that gave you authority, you're nothing." He paused, savoring the moment. "Let this be a lesson," he announced, turning back to the formation. "No one is above the system. No one is immune to the consequences of arrogance." The words echoed across the parade ground, bouncing off buildings, fading into the morning air. Some cadets stood a little straighter, nodding almost imperceptibly. Others looked uncomfortable, uncertain, as if they sensed something wasn't quite right about this performance. Sienna met Voss's eyes for the first time since the proceedings began. Her gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't defiant in the theatrical way he probably expected. It was steady, analytical, the look of someone solving a problem, calculating variables, reaching a conclusion. "I always know my place, sir," she said quietly. The response seemed to confuse him. He'd expected tears maybe, or rage, or desperate attempts at explanation. Instead, she'd given him nothing, just 5 words delivered in a tone so calm it was almost unsettling. Voss turned away, uncomfortable with something he couldn't quite name. He continued speaking to the formation, launching into a lecture about discipline, about respect, about the importance of chain of command. His words blended together, becoming a drone of military jargon and self-important pronouncements. None of them noticed the black SUV that rolled to a stop beyond the perimeter fence. None of them saw the figure inside check his watch, then reach for a phone. None of them understood that decisions were already being made, calls were already being placed, and machinery was already in motion that would turn this morning into something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Sienna had been 22 years old when they recruited her. She'd been a junior at West Point, near the top of her class in tactical analysis and marksmanship. She'd grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a hunting guide and a high school math teacher. She'd learned to shoot when she was 8, learned patience from tracking elk through mountain forests, learned precision from her mother's insistence that every math problem be solved correctly, completely, no shortcuts allowed. The recruiter had approached her during spring break of her junior year. Not on campus, not officially. He'd simply appeared at a coffee shop in Georgetown, sat down across from her without asking, and placed a file folder on the table between them. "We've been watching you," he'd said. Inside the folder were photographs of her, on the shooting range, in classrooms, walking across campus. The images were high-quality professional, taken with equipment that didn't officially exist. Below the photographs were performance evaluations that included details no ordinary observer could know. Her heart rate during stress tests, her decision-making speed during tactical simulations, her psychological profile complete with assessments that went deeper than anything West Point administered. "You have a gift," the recruiter had continued. "Most people react to pressure. You don't react. You calculate. You process. You make optimal decisions while everything around you is burning." He'd paused, studying her face. "We need people like you." He hadn't told her who we were, not then. That came later, after months of additional screening, after she'd graduated with honors and completed Ranger School, after she'd proven herself in ways that couldn't be measured by ordinary standards. The Special Activities Division of the Central Intelligence Agency didn't advertise. They didn't recruit through normal channels. They found people who could operate in the spaces between official military action and covert intelligence work. People who could blend tactical expertise with intelligence gathering. People who could make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. Sienna Blackwell was one of 12 women selected for the program between 2005 and 2010. She was the only one who survived her first 5 years of operational deployment. Afghanistan in 2008 was a contradiction. The war was supposedly winding down violence, decreasing progress being made. The news reports said so. The politicians said so. Even some of the generals said so. But the people doing the actual fighting knew better. Sienna arrived in Kandahar province in August, attached to a unit that officially didn't exist, running missions that were never recorded in any after-action report. Her cover was simple logistics, officer support staff, paper pusher. She wore a uniform, carried a sidearm, attended staff meetings, and filed reports about supply chains and vehicle maintenance. And at night, she became someone else entirely. Her call sign was Phantom. Her team never exceeded 4 operators. Their missions were surgical, specific, designed to solve problems that conventional forces couldn't address. Sometimes they gathered intelligence. Sometimes they eliminated targets. Sometimes they rescued assets who'd gotten trapped behind lines that weren't supposed to exist. They worked in darkness and silence, in spaces where backup didn't exist and mistakes meant death. Sienna's specialty was overwatch. She had an almost supernatural ability to read terrain, to find positions that gave her clear lines of sight while keeping her invisible to enemy forces. She could remain motionless for hours, controlling her breathing, ignoring heat and cold, and insects and thirst, waiting for the moment when her scope would align with a target and her trigger finger would complete a mission. Her longest confirmed kill was from 427 meters, a Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. She'd made the shot during a sandstorm, compensating for wind that shifted every few seconds, accounting for the way heat waves bent light, calculating the trajectory through conditions that made most snipers pack up and wait for better weather. The bullet had taken 4 seconds to reach its target, 4 seconds during which the commander had continued gesturing to his subordinates, completely unaware that death was already traveling toward him at 700 feet per second. He dropped mid-sentence. His lieutenants had scattered, convinced they were under attack by superior forces. They'd abandoned the coordination center, fled into the mountains, and the convoy attacks had stopped for 6 months. One shot, one death, dozens of lives saved. That was how Sienna measured success. Not in medals or recognition, but in calculations. If I do this, these people live. If I don't, they die. The math was brutal, but it was honest. By 2011, she'd transitioned from being just a sniper to being a team leader. They gave her the designation commander, not because of rank, but because of capability. She ran missions that involved multiple assets, complex logistics, coordination with local forces and allied intelligence services. The operation that made her legendary within the intelligence community happened in Kandahar City on a Thursday in September. The American ambassador to Afghanistan was scheduled to visit a newly constructed school. It was supposed to be a goodwill mission, a photo opportunity showing progress and hope. Security had been arranged through official channels, vetted by both military and diplomatic protection services. But Sienna's team had been tracking intercepted communications for 3 weeks. They'd identified a pattern, a thread of coded messages that suggested something larger was being planned. The pieces didn't quite fit together, but her instincts, honed through thousands of hours of operational experience, told her the ambassador was walking into a trap. She'd flagged the concern through proper channels. She'd submitted intelligence reports. She'd requested the visit be postponed, and she'd been overruled. The security apparatus was confident. They had protocols. They had training. They had manpower and technology and experience. What they didn't have was what Sienna had learned in the mountains and deserts and urban hellscapes of Afghanistan, the certainty that the enemy was always more desperate, more willing to die, more committed to their objective than any security force could match. So Sienna had gone anyway. Not officially, not as part of the protective detail. She'd positioned herself on a rooftop 300 meters from the school, wearing civilian clothes, carrying a rifle that couldn't be traced to any American armory. She'd been there for 6 hours when the first attacker appeared. He'd come through a side entrance, moving with purpose, a bulge under his jacket that screamed, "Explosive vest." Sienna had tracked him through her scope, watched him approach the building where the ambassador was greeting teachers and students. Her first shot had been clean. Center mass. The attacker had dropped before he reached the door. His thumb had been on the detonator, but he'd died before his muscles could complete the action. That should have been the end of it. But then 5 more attackers had emerged from different directions, all converging on the building simultaneously. It was coordinated, sophisticated, the kind of attack that demonstrated planning and reconnaissance. Sienna had 4 seconds to make a decision. Standard protocol was to call for backup, to alert the protective detail, to initiate evacuation procedures. But 4 seconds wasn't enough time for any of that. By the time anyone reacted, at least 2 attackers would reach the building, and those explosive vests would turn the school into a tomb. So she'd started shooting. Second target, third target, fourth target. Each shot fired within a second of the previous one, each one accounting for movement and distance and the slight crosswind that had picked up from the west. Her breathing was controlled, her heartbeat steady, her mind processing information faster than conscious thought. Fifth target, sixth target. The last attacker had made it to within 10 feet of the building before her bullet found him. He'd collapsed on the steps, his hand reaching toward the door, the detonator falling from his fingers. And then silence. The entire sequence had lasted 18 seconds. 6 attackers neutralized. 143 people inside the building, including the American ambassador, completely unaware of how close they'd come to death. Sienna had disassembled her rifle, packed it away, and left the rooftop before the first security personnel arrived to investigate the gunfire. By the time the protective detail realized they'd been under attack, she was 3 blocks away, just another person on a street full of people. The official report credited alert security forces with preventing the attack. No mention of a lone sniper. No mention of Sienna Blackwell. No mention of the fact that one woman had saved the life of a diplomat, dozens of children, and prevented an international incident that would have dominated headlines for months. That was fine with her. She didn't need recognition. She needed to know the math had worked out, that the lives saved outnumbered the lives taken, that the mission was complete. Colonel Voss was still lecturing when the atmosphere on the parade ground changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. No sirens, no shouting, just a subtle shift that people trained to sense danger felt immediately the way animals sense an approaching storm. Footsteps echoed across concrete, steady, unhurried, coming from behind the command staff. 3 figures entered the parade ground without escort, without announcement, without any of the protocol that normally accompanied VIP visits. They weren't in uniform, no rank insignia, no unit patches. Just dark suits and sunglasses and an air of authority that needed no decoration. The man in front was Lieutenant General Thaddeus Sterling. He was 67 years old, lean and hard as ironwood, with white hair cropped military short and a face carved from years of making decisions other people couldn't stomach. He'd spent 30 years in Delta Force before transitioning to intelligence work. He'd run operations in countries that didn't officially host American forces. He'd lost fingers, teeth, and parts of his hearing to conflicts that would never appear in history books. And he'd handpicked Sienna Blackwell for the Special Activities Division 13 years ago. Sterling carried a sealed folder under his arm. He walked directly toward Colonel Voss, his 2 companions flanking him like palace guards. Every instructor on the parade ground stiffened. Even Voss, still holding Sienna's rank insignia, seemed to shrink slightly. Sterling stopped 3 feet from the colonel. He didn't salute, didn't introduce himself, just spoke in a voice that carried absolute certainty. This proceeding is suspended. Voss's face flushed red. You're out of line. Identify yourself immediately. Sterling didn't raise his voice. He simply extended the folder. Read. Voss hesitated, then snatched the folder and opened it. The color drained from his face as his eyes scanned the first page. His mouth opened slightly, closed again. His hands began to tremble. A major standing nearby leaned in to look over Voss's shoulder. He immediately stepped back, as if the papers themselves were radioactive. What is this? Voss demanded, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Sterling's tone remained flat professional, the voice of someone delivering information rather than arguing a point. Authorization clearance verification from the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Oversight confirmation from the Joint Special Operations Command. Legal immunity documentation signed by the Secretary of Defense. He paused, letting the words sink in. Captain Sienna Blackwell's assignment to Fort Bragg was a cover role. Her operational authority does not originate from this command structure. It never did. The parade ground fell into a silence so complete that birds could be heard calling from trees beyond the perimeter fence. 200 cadets stood frozen, trying to process what they were hearing. Instructors exchanged glances, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. Sterling turned slightly, his voice carrying now to every person present. Commander Blackwell's presence is required elsewhere. The word commander hit the formation like a physical shockwave. Sterling faced Sienna directly. He nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals. Commander Blackwell, your presence is required for operational briefing. Immediate deployment. Sienna stepped forward. The movement was smooth, controlled, without any theatrical flourish. She didn't look victorious. She didn't look vindicated. She simply looked like a soldier who'd been given new orders and was preparing to execute them. Sterling continued speaking, his words landing like hammer blows in the stunned silence. Commander Blackwell has directed 47 classified operations under Special Access Program designation IMBRA. These operations prevented incidents that will never be recorded publicly. Her actions were reviewed by oversight committees approved at the highest levels of government and protected under national security protocols. He turned back to Voss, who stood holding the folder with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Every accusation you've made this morning is, legally speaking, irrelevant. Captain Blackwell answers to authority several levels above this installation. She always has. Voss tried to speak. No words emerged. His throat worked soundlessly, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of what he'd just done. Sienna glanced once at the steel table where her insignia lay. She didn't pick them up. didn't reach for them, just looked at them for a moment as if saying goodbye to props she no longer needed. That rank was never the point, she said quietly. Then she turned to face the formation. 200 young faces stared back at her, wide-eyed mouths slightly open, trying to reconcile the humiliated captain from 5 minutes ago with the commander standing before them now. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying across the parade ground without being loud. What you saw today wasn't leadership. It was insecurity disguised as authority. Learn the difference. She let the words hang in the air for 3 seconds. Then she walked towards Sterling and his two companions, her stride steady, her posture perfect, leaving behind 200 cadets who would spend the rest of their lives telling this story. Colonel Garrett Voss stood alone at the front of the formation, still holding rank insignia that had never meant what he thought they meant, understanding too late that he'd just tried to humiliate someone who operated on a level he couldn't comprehend. The black SUV was already rolling forward to meet them at the gate. And somewhere far above Fort Bragg, in offices with no names on the doors, people who made decisions about national security were already discussing where Commander Sienna Blackwell would be needed next. Because the world kept turning, threats kept emerging, and there would always be a need for people who could operate in the shadows, who could make impossible decisions, who could carry the weight of secrets that would break ordinary people. Sienna Blackwell was one of those people. She always had been. And nothing that happened on a parade ground in North Carolina could ever change that. The parade ground remained frozen in shocked silence for several seconds after Sienna disappeared through the gate. Then, like a dam breaking the formation, dissolved into chaos. Cadets turned to each other, voices rising in excited whispers. Instructors stood in tight clusters, speaking in low, urgent tones. Colonel Garrett Voss remained at the front, still holding the folder Sterling had given him, his face ashen. A senior NCO finally restored order, barking commands that snapped the cadets back into formation. But the damage was done. The carefully constructed illusion of military hierarchy, of absolute authority flowing from rank and position, had been shattered in less than 5 minutes. Among the 200 cadets was a young man named Marcus Webb. He was 23, from Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a nurse. He joined the military to pay for college, to learn discipline, to become something more than what his small town could offer. He'd been standing in the third row, close enough to see everything, to hear every word. And he'd seen something in Captain Blackwell that he couldn't quite name. A stillness, a certainty. The kind of presence his grandfather, a Marine who'd fought in Korea, used to talk about. Men who'd seen the elephant, his grandfather called them. People who'd been tested in ways that couldn't be simulated or trained. Marcus had watched Blackwell stand there, while Voss stripped away her rank, and he'd seen no fear in her eyes. No anger. Just patience, as if she were waiting for something inevitable to arrive. Now he understood why. The formation was dismissed an hour later. Normal training schedules were canceled. Officers disappeared into administrative buildings for meetings that cadets weren't privy to. Rumors spread through the base like wildfire. Some claimed Blackwell was actually a general operating undercover. Others said she was CIA, maybe FBI, possibly something even more secretive. A few insisted the whole thing had been staged, some kind of elaborate training exercise about leadership or loyalty. Marcus didn't believe any of it. He'd seen Voss's face when he opened that folder. That wasn't acting. That was the look of a man who just realized he'd made a career-ending mistake. By evening, word had spread beyond Fort Bragg. Phone calls were made, emails sent. People who worked in intelligence circles, who had connections to the Pentagon or Langley, started asking questions. Most of those questions went unanswered, which only made the story more compelling. And in a secure conference room in McLean, Virginia, Lieutenant General Thaddeus Sterling sat across from Sienna Blackwell and delivered news she'd been expecting for 6 months. "We found him," Sterling said. Sienna nodded slowly. "How certain?" 92%. Financial transactions match the pattern. Communications intercepts confirm he's been in contact with hostile intelligence services. And 3 weeks ago, he accessed files he had no operational reason to view. Sterling slid a photograph across the table. It showed a man in his early 50s, trim and professional looking, wearing a military uniform with the rank of full colonel. Colonel Nathan Reeves, Sterling continued, assigned to Fort Bragg as senior tactical advisor. 30 years of service, spotless record until 18 months ago when he started accumulating debt. Gambling mostly, underground poker games in D.C. He was down nearly $200,000 when someone offered him a way out. Sienna studied the photograph. She'd seen Reeves around the base, had even attended a few briefings where he was present. He was the kind of officer who blended in, who never drew attention to himself, who seemed competent but unremarkable. The perfect profile for a penetration agent. How many? Sienna asked quietly. Sterling's jaw tightened. 9 confirmed deaths. There may be more we haven't connected yet. He had access to operational databases, deployment schedules, asset identities. He's been feeding information to a cutout who passes it to Russian intelligence. Does he know we're onto him? Not yet, but after this morning's performance, he will be suspicious. We need to move fast. Sienna leaned back in her chair. You used me as bait. It wasn't a question. Sterling didn't deny it. We needed Reeves to think Fort Bragg was secure, that our investigation was focused elsewhere. Your assignment there was cover, yes, but it also gave us a reason to have surveillance assets in place without raising suspicion. Reeves thinks you're just another officer rotating through. He has no idea you've been mapping his network for 6 months. Sterling paused. Voss's little performance this morning actually works in our favor. Now Reeves will assume you're gone, that you're no longer a factor. He'll relax, get careless. And when he does, we take him. When he does, we take him. Sienna stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Virginia countryside stretched green and peaceful under afternoon sun. It looked nothing like Afghanistan or Syria or any of the other places where she'd spent years of her life. It looked safe, comfortable, deceptive. Tell me about them, she said. The 9. Sterling opened another folder. His voice became clinical, detached, the way people spoke when discussing casualties to avoid feeling them too deeply. Operation Sandcastle, March of last year. CIA analyst in Yemen. She was feeding us information about planned attacks on shipping lanes. Reeves accessed her file 2 days before extraction. The militia found her in a safe house in Aden. They tortured her for 16 hours before killing her. Sienna's hands tightened into fists behind her back. Operation Redline, June, 3-man reconnaissance team in Syria. Chemical weapons facility. Reeves pulled their insertion route from the operational database. They walked into an ambush 6 hours after landing. All 3 KIA. Sterling continued through the list. Each operation, each casualty, each life ended because one man had decided his gambling debts were worth more than his oath, his honor, his duty to protect the people who trusted him. By the time Sterling finished, 9 names had been spoken aloud. 9 people who'd served their country, who'd risked everything, who'd died because Nathan Reeves needed money for cards and dice and the thrill of betting on outcomes he couldn't control. I want him, Sienna said quietly. I know. Not for trial, not for some plea deal where he trades information for a reduced sentence. Sterling met her eyes. That's not my call to make. Make it your call. The general was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to stand beside her at the window. You know I can't authorize what you're asking. There are laws, procedures. Even traitors get due process. Those 9 people didn't get due process. No, Sterling agreed. They didn't. They stood in silence, watching shadows lengthen across the Virginia hills. Finally, Sterling spoke again, his voice softer now. I'm putting you back on the ground at Fort Bragg. Official story is, you're returning to collect your personal effects, wrap up administrative details. Unofficially, you're going to find Reeves's handler, document the entire network, and gather enough evidence that there is no possibility of acquittal. He turned to face her directly. And if Reeves decides to resist arrest, if he makes any move that could be construed as threatening to an apprehension team, well, people who betray their country rarely surrender peacefully. Sienna understood what he was offering. Permission implicit and deniable to ensure Nathan Reeves never saw the inside of a courtroom. When do I leave? She asked. Tomorrow morning. I'm sending you back with a team. They'll maintain distance, let you operate independently, but they'll be there if things escalate. Sterling returned to his chair and pulled out another document. There's one more thing. That little scene this morning is going to have consequences. Voss is finished. He'll be reassigned to some administrative position where he can't hurt anyone. But the cadets who witnessed it, the instructors who were there, they're going to talk. They're going to ask questions. Let them talk. It draws attention. Attention is dangerous in our line of work. Sienna turned from the window. Those cadets needed to learn something. That rank isn't the same as authority. That the loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest. That leadership is about making hard decisions, not performing for an audience. Very noble, Sterling said dryly, but nobility doesn't keep an operation secret. Then we'll manage the story. Give them a version they can repeat that's close enough to truth without compromising anything operational. Sterling considered this. What did you have in mind? Sienna smiled slightly. It was the first time she'd smiled since the parade ground. Tell them I was Special Forces liaison, that I was coordinating joint training exercises, that Voss didn't have the clearance to know what I was really doing and jump to conclusions. It's boring enough to be believable and vague enough to shut down most questions. And if someone digs deeper, then they find classified personnel files that confirm the cover story. Because those files already exist, don't they? Sterling's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes acknowledged that yes, those files had existed for years. Multiple layers of false documentation designed to protect Sienna's real identity and operational history. You should have been running operations from a desk years ago, Sterling said. You're too valuable to keep in the field. I'm more valuable in the field. You're going to get killed in the field. Maybe, Sienna acknowledged, but I won't die wondering if I did enough, if I made a difference. Sterling closed the folder. You've made more difference than most generals. You've saved more lives than most battalions. The work you've done will never be fully documented, never properly acknowledged. You're fine with that. I have to be, Sienna replied simply. The general stood and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back one more time. That rank Voss took from you. You can have it back. We can arrange a promotion if you want. Make you a major, give you the recognition you've earned. Sienna shook her head. I meant what I said this morning. The rank was never the point. Sterling nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected. Get some rest. Transportation leaves at 0600, and Sienna, boy, sir. When you find Reeves when this is over, take some leave. Real leave, not cover duty somewhere. Actual time away from operations. I'll think about it. That's what you said last time. And I thought about it. Sterling almost smiled. Then he left, closing the door behind him, leaving Sienna alone with her thoughts and the weight of 9 names she hadn't been able to save. She sat down at the conference table and pulled the photograph of Nathan Reeves closer. Studied his face, tried to see the traitor behind the professional exterior, wondered what he told himself to justify what he'd done. Did he sleep well at night? Did he think about the people who died because of him? Or had he learned to compartmentalize, to separate consequences from actions? To tell himself that his debts and his needs mattered more than abstract concepts like loyalty or honor? Sienna had killed 23 people in her operational career. She knew the exact number because she'd made it a point to remember each one. Not their names, she often didn't know their names, but the context, the reason, the calculation that had made their deaths necessary to save others. 23 people dead by her hand. And yet she slept fine most nights because she knew the math worked out. Those 23 deaths had prevented hundreds of others. The equation balanced even if it left scars. But Nathan Reeves would be different. His death, if it came to that, wouldn't be about preventing future casualties. It would be about justice for past ones, about ensuring that betrayal came with a price. Sienna wondered if that would feel different, if executing justice felt cleaner or dirtier than executing military necessity. She supposed she'd find out soon enough. The flight back to Fort Bragg took 3 hours. Sienna traveled in civilian clothes, sitting in an unmarked government SUV with tinted windows. The 2 agents accompanying her, a man and woman in their 30s, both former military, both now working for agencies that didn't officially conduct domestic operations, maintained professional silence during the drive. They arrived at the base just after sunset. Instead of going through the main gate, they used a service entrance near the motor pool. Sienna's temporary quarters were in a nondescript building on the edge of the installation, far from the main barracks where cadets would spot her. The building was designated for visiting personnel officers rotating through for short-term assignments or training. Sienna had stayed there before during her initial deployment to Fort Bragg 6 months ago. The room was spare but functional. Single-bed desk chair bathroom, a window that looked out on nothing interesting. She unpacked the small bag she'd brought, a few changes of clothes, laptop, encrypted phone, handgun with extra magazines, the tools of her trade minimal and efficient. At 2200 hours, her phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Sterling, containing a single line of text. Package is mobile. Destination unknown. Package meant Reeves. Mobile meant he'd left the base. Destination unknown meant their surveillance team was following him, but hadn't yet determined where he was going. Sienna acknowledged the message and settled in to wait. Surveillance work was 90% patience and 10% action. You learn to accept the waiting, to use it productively, to keep your mind sharp for the moments when things move fast. She pulled up Reeves's file on her laptop and read through it again. Not the official personnel record she'd memorized that months ago, but the shadow file, the one that documented everything the official record left out. Nathan Reeves had grown up in Pennsylvania, son of a steelworker who lost his job when the mills closed. He joined the military at 19, served competently, if not brilliantly, worked his way up through the ranks. He deployed to Iraq twice, Afghanistan once, earned a Bronze Star for his actions during an ambush outside Fallujah in 2004. For 28 years, he'd been exactly what the military needed: reliable, professional, unremarkable. Then his wife had died of cancer. Medical bills had piled up despite insurance. Reeves had started drinking, then gambling. The gambling became compulsive. Small bets became large bets. Losses mounted. He drained his savings, maxed out credit cards, taken loans from predatory lenders who charged interest rates that made recovery impossible. And then someone had approached him with an offer. Money for information. Not much at first, just minor details, the kind of thing that seemed harmless. Deployment schedules, base layouts, information that was technically classified but not particularly sensitive. The money had been good, enough to make a dent in his debts, enough to make him feel like maybe he could climb out of the hole he'd dug. So he'd done it again and again, each time taking slightly more risk, assessing slightly more sensitive information, telling himself that he wasn't really betraying anyone, that the intelligence he provided wasn't the kind that would get people killed. Until it did. The first death connected to Reeves's leaks was a CIA analyst in Baghdad. She'd been providing intelligence on Shia militia movements. Someone had leaked her identity, and she'd been abducted from her apartment. Her body was found 3 days later. Reeves had accessed her personnel file 2 weeks before her death. He should have stopped then. Should have realized the magnitude of what he'd done. Should have turned himself in, accepted the consequences, tried to salvage some fragment of honor from the wreckage of his choices. But he hadn't stopped, because by then he was in too deep. The people he was working for had leverage. They had evidence of what he'd done. They had ways of making his life even worse if he refused to continue. So he had kept going, kept leaking, kept telling himself that he didn't have a choice, that circumstances had forced him into this, that he was as much a victim as anyone. 8 more people had died. 8 more names added to a list that Reeves probably tried not to think about. Sienna closed the file and stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkened base. Somewhere out there, Reeves was driving to meet his handler, to pass along whatever information he'd most recently stolen to collect payment for services rendered. And tomorrow or the day after or whenever the surveillance team had documented enough evidence to guarantee a conviction, she would be part of the team that took him down. She wondered if he would resist, if he would try to run or fight or bargain, if he would show any awareness of the consequences his actions had caused, or if he would just look confused and frightened and make excuses the way most people did when forced to confront the reality of their choices. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from Sterling. Package at location, meeting in progress. Stand by for further instructions. Sienna acknowledged and returned to her laptop. She pulled up satellite imagery of Fort Bragg and the surrounding area, studying roads and terrain, planning routes and contingencies. If Reeves ran, where would he go? If his handler tried to extract him, how would they do it? What were the vulnerabilities, the choke points, the places where intervention would be most effective? Her mind moved through scenarios like a chess player considering moves ahead. If this happens, I do that. If that fails, I do this. Always thinking 3 steps forward, always preparing for the moment when plans broke down and training took over. At 2300 hours, her phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call. Sterling's voice came through, encrypted and clear. We have a problem. Sienna's pulse quickened slightly. What kind of problem? Reeves met his handler as expected, but there was someone else at the meeting, someone we didn't anticipate. Who? Sterling hesitated, which was unusual for him. Major General Philip Hargrove. The name hit Sienna like cold water. Hargrove was senior military brass assigned to the Pentagon with oversight responsibilities for multiple special operations units. He had access to information that made Reeves's leaks look trivial by comparison. You're certain? Sienna asked. Surveillance team got photographs. Positive identification. Hargrove was at that meeting for 17 minutes. We don't know what was discussed, but the implications are clear. The network is bigger than we thought. Much bigger, Sterling confirmed, and much more dangerous. If Hargrove is compromised, we have to assume multiple operations are at risk. People in the field could be exposed. Assets could be burned. This is catastrophic if we don't contain it immediately. Sienna's mind raced through possibilities. Does Hargrove know we're watching Reeves? Not yet, but he will soon. Men at his level have sources, connections. We need to move before he realizes the operation is compromised. What are your orders? I'm pulling together an apprehension team. Military police, FBI, counterintelligence, Justice Department lawyers. We're going to take both of them simultaneously. Reeves at Fort Bragg Hargrove in D.C. Coordinated action to prevent either one from warning the other. When in front of 48 hours. We need time to prepare to make sure everything is documented and legal. This is going to be high profile, so we can't afford mistakes. Sienna understood what he wasn't saying. This would be public. There would be hearings, investigations, media coverage. The kind of exposure their world normally avoided at all costs. What do you need from me? She asked. Stay close to Reeves. If he starts acting suspicious, if he tries to run, I need you to stall him until the apprehension team arrives. Don't engage directly unless absolutely necessary. Understood. And Sienna, this morning's incident with Voss actually helps us now. Reeves will have heard about it. He'll think you're off the base, out of the picture. Use that. Let him believe you're not a threat. Sterling paused. But if he does figure out what's happening, if he tries to destroy evidence or harm someone else to cover his tracks, you have authorization to do whatever is necessary to stop him. Is that clear? Crystal clear, sir. The call ended. Sienna sat in the darkness of her room processing the new information. The operation had just escalated from catching one traitor to dismantling an espionage network that reached into the highest levels of military command. The damage assessment would take months, maybe years. Entire operations would need to be reviewed. Assets would need to be relocated. Security protocols would need to be overhauled. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Colonel Nathan Reeves, a man who'd sold his honor for gambling money and pulled a general down with him. Sienna changed into dark clothes and grabbed her handgun. She wasn't going to engage Reeves tonight, but she wanted to know where he was, what he was doing, whether he showed any signs of knowing the walls were closing in. She left her quarters through a side door and moved through shadows toward the administrative complex where Reeves maintained an office. The base was quiet at this hour, most personnel asleep or in their barracks. Security patrols followed predictable routes. Cameras covered main thoroughfares, but left gaps in less traveled areas. Sienna knew every gap. She'd spent months mapping the base's security systems, learning rhythms and patterns, identifying places where someone could move unseen. She reached the administrative building and found a position in the tree line 30 meters away. From here, she had clear sight lines to Reeves's office window. The lights were on. She could see his silhouette moving back and forth, pacing. He was agitated. That was interesting. The meeting with his handler should have been routine. If anything, he should be relieved, assured that his network remained secure. Instead, he looked nervous, worried. Sienna settled into a prone position and watched through compact binoculars. Reeves paced for another 10 minutes, then sat at his desk. He pulled out his phone and made a call. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, Reeves stood and walked to a filing cabinet. He pulled out several folders, flipped through them, then returned them to their place. He was checking something, verifying something. Sienna's instincts prickled. Something had spooked him. Either the handler had said something during their meeting, or Reeves had noticed something on his own. Either way, his behavior suggested he was starting to suspect surveillance. She pulled out her encrypted phone and sent a message to Sterling. Package is nervous. Checking files. Possible awareness. The response came back within seconds. Maintain observation. Do not engage unless he attempts to leave base or destroy evidence. Sienna acknowledged and returned her attention to the office window. Reeves was at his computer now, typing rapidly. She couldn't see the screen from this angle, but his body language suggested urgency. After 20 minutes, he stopped typing and leaned back in his chair. He sat motionless for a long moment, then pulled out his phone again. Another call, this one shorter. When it ended, Reeves stood and grabbed his jacket. He was leaving. Sienna shifted position, preparing to follow. If Reeves left the base at this hour, it meant something significant. Either he was meeting someone or he was preparing to run. She watched him exit the building and walk toward the parking area where officers kept their personal vehicles. He climbed into a sedan and started the engine. The headlights came on. Sienna was already moving, circling through shadows toward her own vehicle. She reached it 30 seconds before Reeves pulled out of the parking area. She waited until he'd passed, then followed at a distance. Reeves drove toward the main gate, then turned onto a service road that led to the motor pool. He parked near a maintenance shed and killed the engine. Then he sat there waiting. Sienna parked her vehicle behind a storage building and approached on foot. She moved slowly, carefully, using available cover. The motor pool was lit by sodium vapor lights that created harsh shadows and pools of darkness. Reeves sat in his car for 5 minutes. Then another vehicle arrived, a pickup truck with civilian plates. A man got out, walked to Reeves's car, and climbed into the passenger seat. Sienna couldn't see the man's face from her position, but his build and posture suggested military or former military. The two men talked for several minutes. Then the stranger handed Reeves something, a package of some kind. Reeves opened it, examined the contents, then nodded. The stranger left. Reeves sat in his car for another minute, then drove back toward the administrative complex. Sienna photographed the stranger's license plate as he drove away, then sent it to Sterling with a brief description of the exchange. Within minutes, she received a response. Plate registered to Clark Donovan, former Army intelligence, known associate of Russian cutouts. Continue surveillance. So Reeves was being extracted. The package was probably new identification money travel documents, everything he'd need to disappear, which meant he knew the operation was compromised, which meant either Hargrove had warned him or Reeves had figured it out on his own. Either way, they were out of time. Sienna sent another message to Sterling. Package is preparing to run, extraction assets in play, recommend immediate apprehension. The response took longer this time. When it came, the message was terse. Apprehension team will be in position by 0600. Maintain surveillance until then. If package attempts to leave base, you are authorized to intercept. 6 hours. Sienna checked her watch. It was just past midnight. She had to keep Reeves on the base for 6 more hours without him knowing he was being watched. She returned to her vehicle and drove back toward the administrative complex. Reeves's car was parked in its usual spot. Lights were still on in his office. Sienna found her observation position again and settled in to wait. She'd done this hundreds of times before, waiting in darkness, watching a target prepared to act the moment circumstances required it. The hours crawled past. Reeves continued working in his office, occasionally standing to pace frequently, checking his phone. At 0300, he finally turned off the lights and left. He walked to his car, started the engine, and drove toward the housing area where senior officers lived. Sienna followed at a distance. Reeves pulled into his driveway and went inside. The lights in his house came on. Sienna positioned herself where she could watch both the front and back exits. At 0430, the lights went off. Reeves was either sleeping or pretending to sleep. At 0545, 3 black SUVs rolled quietly onto the base through the service gate. They parked 2 blocks from Reeves's house and disgorged a dozen men in tactical gear. FBI, probably with military police backup. Sterling's voice came through Sienna's phone. Apprehension team is in position. We're moving in 3 minutes. Stand by in case he runs. Copy that. Sienna watched as the team moved into position around Reeves's house. They were professional, efficient, covering every exit. At precisely 0600, they breached the door. Sienna heard the shouts from 2 blocks away. FBI! Get on the ground! FBI! Then silence. Then more shouting. Then a man in tactical gear appeared at the front door and waved to the team leader. They had him. Sienna drove to the house and parked across the street. She watched as Colonel Nathan Reeves was led out in handcuffs, wearing pajamas, his face pale and shocked. He looked around wildly as if hoping to see someone who might help him. His eyes found Sienna standing beside her vehicle. For a moment, they locked gazes. She wondered if he recognized her, if he understood who she was and what she represented. Then he was placed in the back of an SUV and driven away. The entire operation had taken less than 5 minutes. Sterling appeared beside Sienna. Hargrove was taken simultaneously in D.C., both in custody, both facing espionage charges. Justice Department is filing federal indictments today. What about the families? Sienna asked quietly. They'll be notified that the person responsible for their loved ones' deaths has been arrested. They won't get all the details. Some of it is too classified, but they'll know justice is being done. Sienna nodded slowly. Justice. Such a clean word for such messy circumstances. The damage Reeves and Hargrove had done would echo through the intelligence community for years. But at least the bleeding had stopped. You did good work, Sterling said. 6 months of surveillance, of maintaining cover, of putting up with people like Voss, who had no idea what you were really doing. This wouldn't have happened without you. It shouldn't have needed to happen at all, Sienna replied. If we had better security protocols, if we screened people more carefully, if we paid attention to the warning signs. We're humans, Sterling said. We make mistakes. All we can do is try to catch them before they become catastrophic. He paused. There's going to be a hearing, congressional oversight. They'll want to know how 2 senior officers managed to operate an espionage ring for over a year without being detected. Some of it will be classified, but enough will be public that Fort Bragg is going to be under intense scrutiny. The cadets from yesterday, Sienna said, they're going to be questioned. Probably, which means we need to get your cover story locked down. As far as anyone knows, you were Special Operations Liaison, you were conducting classified work, and Voss overstepped his authority. That's all they need to know. And the part where I'm actually CIA running counterintelligence operations, that part stays classified. Those cadets saw a captain get her rank stripped and then restored. They don't need to know the rest. Sienna looked back at Reeves's house. Crime scene investigators were already inside documenting everything, collecting evidence. His life was over. His career was over. He'd spend the rest of his days in prison, assuming he wasn't executed for espionage. She felt no satisfaction in that. No triumph, just a weary sense of completion. One mission ended, others waiting. "Get some rest," Sterling said. "Real rest this time. I'm putting you on mandatory leave for 2 weeks." "I don't need—" "It's not a request, Commander. 2 weeks. Take them. Because when you come back, I've got another assignment lined up. Something bigger than this. Something that's going to require every skill you have." Sienna looked at him. "How much bigger?" Sterling smiled grimly. "The kind of big that makes this morning's arrest look like a training exercise. But that's a conversation for 2 weeks from now. For today, you're done. Go home. Sleep. Do whatever normal people do when they're not hunting traitors." He walked away, leaving Sienna standing alone as dawn broke over Fort Bragg. The base was waking up. Cadets emerging for morning physical training. Officers heading to offices. The daily routine continuing as if nothing significant had happened. But something had happened. 2 traitors were in custody. And somewhere in files that would remain sealed for decades, Sienna Blackwell's name would appear in reports documenting an operation that prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach. No one would ever thank her publicly. No medals would be awarded. No promotions offered. But she'd done her job. She'd kept the math balanced. Lives saved versus lives lost. And for Sienna Blackwell, that had always been enough. The news broke 48 hours later. Not the classified details, not the operational specifics, but enough to send shockwaves through Fort Bragg and the wider military community. 2 senior officers arrested on espionage charges, a counterintelligence operation that had lasted 6 months. References to significant breaches, an ongoing investigation that hinted at damage far worse than what was being publicly acknowledged. The base became a circus. News crews camped outside the gates. Congressional staffers arrived to conduct interviews. Military Criminal Investigation Command agents moved through offices and barracks, asking questions, taking statements, building cases that would eventually wind through military and civilian courts. Marcus Webb found himself in a small conference room 3 days after Reeves's arrest, sitting across from 2 men in suits who introduced themselves as Department of Defense investigators. They asked him to describe what he'd witnessed during the formation. Marcus told them everything. The public humiliation, Colonel Voss stripping Captain Blackwell's rank, the arrival of General Sterling, the revelation that Blackwell was operating under cover authority. The investigators listened without expression, taking notes. When Marcus finished, they thanked him. "Can I ask something?" Marcus said as they were preparing to leave. The lead investigator paused. "You can ask." "Captain Blackwell, was she really CIA?" The investigator's face remained neutral. "Captain Blackwell was assigned to Fort Bragg as Special Operations Liaison coordinating joint training exercises. Her work required security clearances that Colonel Voss was not read into. That's all I can tell you." But the general called her commander. Military personnel sometimes carry courtesy ranks that differ from their official designation. This is not unusual in special operations environments. It was a non-answer disguised as information, and Marcus knew it. Whatever Captain Blackwell really was, that information was locked behind classifications he'd never have access to. That evening, Marcus and 6 other cadets gathered in the common area of their barracks. They spoke in low voices. "I heard Reeves was selling information to the Russians," one cadet said, "that people died because of him. What I don't understand," and a third cadet said, "is what Blackwell was doing here. If she was really some kind of undercover operative, why would they send her to a training base?" Marcus had been thinking about this. She was hunting Reeves. That's the only thing that makes sense. They sent her here to catch him. For 6 months, that's a long time to maintain cover. Maybe that's what it took. Maybe she had to wait for him to make a mistake. They fell silent. The idea that one of their instructors had been conducting a covert investigation while pretending to be a regular officer felt surreal. "That thing she said," Marcus finally spoke, "about learning the difference between leadership and insecurity disguised as authority. I keep thinking about that." "Voss was a piece of work," someone agreed. "Everyone knew he had issues, But he was a colonel. You don't question colonels. Maybe we should, Marcus said quietly. Maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the lesson is that rank doesn't make someone right. That real leadership is about making hard calls and living with consequences, not performing for an audience. The group considered this. It was a dangerous thought in a military environment where obedience to authority was fundamental, but it was also true. One of the cadets looked at Marcus. You think we'll ever see her again, Blackwell? Marcus shook his head. People like that finish their mission and move on. We were just background noise in whatever she was really doing. But he was wrong about that. 2 days later, Sienna Blackwell returned to Fort Bragg. She arrived without fanfare, driving through the main gate in a civilian vehicle wearing jeans and a leather jacket. She checked in at the visitor center, received a temporary pass, and requested permission to address the cadet formation. The request worked its way up the chain of command. The new base commander considered it carefully. Then he approved it. Word spread quickly. By 1400 hours, every cadet on the base knew that Captain Blackwell was coming back. The parade ground filled rapidly, cadets taking their positions with unusual eagerness. Sienna arrived precisely at 1400 hours. She walked onto the parade ground alone, still in civilian clothes, no rank insignia, no symbols of authority. Just a woman who'd spent 13 years operating in shadows, who'd saved more lives than most soldiers would ever know about. Lieutenant General Sterling stood at the edge of the formation, watching. He'd objected to this, had argued that returning to Fort Bragg was unnecessary risk. But she'd insisted, and he'd eventually relented, because those cadets deserved answers. The formation stood at attention. 200 young faces looked forward, eyes locked on Sienna as she walked to the center. She stopped in the exact spot where she'd stood while Voss stripped her rank. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there letting them see that she was real, that she'd come back, that whatever had happened here hadn't broken her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly without being loud. Some of you have been asking questions about what happened here, about who I am, about what this was all about. She paused. I can't answer most of those questions. Some information is classified, some operations are ongoing. Some details will remain sealed for decades. That's the nature of the work I do. She began walking slowly along the front rank, making eye contact with individual cadets. But I can tell you this, 6 months ago I was assigned to Fort Bragg as part of a classified counterintelligence operation. My job was to identify and document a security breach that had cost American lives overseas. I was given a cover identity as a training officer. I did all the things a normal captain would do. She stopped walking and turned to face the full formation. And Colonel Voss, who didn't have the clearance to know what I was really doing, concluded that I was insubordinate. So he decided to make an example of me. Absolute silence. What Colonel Voss didn't know is that I've spent 13 years making decisions in places where one mistake means death, where the missions I've conducted have saved lives in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged. She paused. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this because you need to understand something fundamental about leadership and authority. Her voice hardened slightly. Rank is not the same as competence. Volume is not the same as confidence. The loudest voice in the room is not always the strongest. And sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you never notice because they're too busy doing actual work to worry about recognition. She gestured toward the spot where the steel table had sat. When Colonel Voss took my rank, he thought he was teaching you about obedience, about respecting the chain of command, about knowing your place. Her eyes swept across the formation. But here's what you actually learned. You learned that authority can be abused, that power can be wielded for personal reasons, that sometimes the system gets it wrong. She let that hang. You also learned that real strength doesn't need decorations, that real leadership doesn't require applause, that doing the right thing often means standing alone and accepting consequences without complaint. Marcus Webb felt his throat tighten. This was the lesson he'd been struggling to articulate. I didn't need those rank insignia, Sienna continued. I never did. My authority comes from competence, from experience, from trust placed in me by people who've seen what I can do. That's not something you can pin on a uniform or strip away in a ceremony. She stood at attention. Some of you will have long military careers. Others will serve in different ways. But all of you will eventually face a moment where you have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right. Her voice dropped slightly. When that moment comes, remember what you saw here. Remember that standing up for what you believe in has consequences. Remember that doing the right thing doesn't always feel victorious. Remember that sometimes the most important victories happen in silence, where no one applauds. She took a breath. Colonel Nathan Reeves was arrested 3 days ago for espionage. The investigation that led to his arrest lasted 6 months. I was part of that investigation. She let this settle. People died because one man valued money over honor. Their names will remain classified. Their families will never fully understand what they died for. Her voice hardened. That's the reality of the world I operate in. We serve in silence. We accept risks most people can't imagine. And when operations go wrong, when good people die, we don't get to process that grief publicly. We just move on to the next mission. She was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know that service is complicated. That following orders is important, but so is thinking critically about those orders. That loyalty matters, but so does integrity. That sometimes doing your job means standing up to people who outrank you. She straightened. Colonel Voss made a mistake. He let personal feelings override professional judgment. He abused his authority, and he paid for it. But you know what? He was also a decorated officer who served this country for 30 years. He earned a Bronze Star in combat. He led men under fire. His career shouldn't be defined only by his worst moment. This surprised the formation. They'd expected condemnation. People are complicated, Sienna said. They're capable of both honor and pettiness, courage and weakness. The military doesn't change that. It just puts those contradictions under pressure. She began walking again. When I stood here last week while my rank was stripped, some of you felt satisfaction. Others felt uncomfortable but stayed silent. A few wanted to speak up but didn't know how. She looked directly at a cadet in the front rank. All of those reactions are human. But here's what I want you to take away. Her voice became firm. The next time you see someone being treated unjustly, speak up. Even if it's risky. Even if it costs you something. Because silence in the face of injustice is its own form of betrayal. She moved to the center again. I don't expect you to be heroes. I don't expect you to risk your careers every time someone makes a questionable decision. But I do expect you to think, to question, to recognize when authority is being used properly and when it's being abused. She came to attention. That's all I came here to say. You're going to hear many versions of what happened here. Some will be accurate. Most will be speculation. Just remember what you actually saw. A system that sometimes fails. People who do their best in impossible circumstances. And the importance of maintaining your integrity even when no one's watching. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. If any of you end up in intelligence work, if any of you find yourselves operating in the shadows, remember this. The work matters. The mission matters. But the moment you start valuing the mission more than the people you're trying to protect, that's when you become part of the problem. With that, she walked off the parade ground. No salute, no ceremony. Just a woman who'd said what needed to be said. The formation was dismissed 10 minutes later. Cadets dispersed, slowly processing what they'd heard. Some were inspired, some were confused, but all of them had been forced to think about leadership in new ways. Marcus found himself walking with 3 other cadets. None of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, one said what they were all thinking. I want to be like her. Like Blackwell. Yeah, someone who doesn't need rank to have authority. Someone who does the job without worrying about credit. Marcus nodded slowly. Me too, but I don't think you can just decide to be like that. I think you have to earn it. Through experience. Through making hard calls. Through proving yourself when no one's watching. So how do we start? I guess we start by paying attention. By learning from people who know more than we do. By making the most of every training opportunity. He paused. And by remembering that leadership isn't about being the loudest or the most decorated. It's about being the person others trust when everything goes wrong. Sterling was waiting for Sienna when she returned to her vehicle. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed. That was quite a speech, he said. They deserved as much truth as I could give them. You realize you just inspired about 50 cadets to try to join the intelligence community. Sienna smiled slightly. Good. We need people who think critically. Sterling pushed off from the vehicle. Reeves is talking. He's naming names, trying to negotiate a deal. Hargrove is staying silent, but his lawyer is making noise about a trial. Will there be a trial? Probably. The Justice Department wants to make an example. It's going to be ugly. A lot of classified information is going to become public. Sienna nodded. High-profile espionage cases always turned into circuses. What about the families? She asked quietly. Sterling's expression softened. I met with them yesterday, told them what I could, that the person responsible was in custody, that justice was being done. Most were grateful just to have answers. He paused. One of them, the wife of a case officer who died in Baghdad, asked me to thank whoever caught Reeves. I told her I would. He met Sienna's eyes. So thank you. On behalf of those who will never know your name, thank you for 6 months of maintaining cover under difficult circumstances, for seeing this through even when it meant enduring public humiliation. Sienna looked away. Gratitude always made her uncomfortable. She'd done her job, that's all. What's next? She asked. Sterling pulled an envelope from his jacket. 2 weeks mandatory leave. Effective immediately. Non-negotiable. Go somewhere quiet. Sleep. Do whatever normal people do when they're not hunting traitors. And after 2 weeks, we have a situation developing in Eastern Europe. Russian intelligence is running a new operation targeting NATO infrastructure. We need someone to infiltrate their network and neutralize key assets. Sterling's expression became serious. It's dangerous, probably the most dangerous assignment that I've offered you. Success rate for this kind of deep cover operation is about 60%. Sienna took the envelope. When do I leave? Not for 2 weeks. You're on mandatory leave. Remember, use the time. Rest. Because once this operation starts, you might not get another break for a year. He turned to go, then stopped. Sienna. Sir, that thing you said to the cadets about valuing people more than the mission, you should take your own advice sometimes. He walked away before she could respond. But as Sterling reached his vehicle, he paused, turned back. There's one more thing, he called out. Colonel Voss requested to see you. He's at Walter Reed Medical Center. Had a heart attack 2 days ago. Stress-related, the doctors say. He's stable, but... Sterling hesitated. He asked if you'd visit. Said he needs to say something before the congressional hearings begin. Sienna stared at him. Why would I do that? Because you're better than he is, Sterling said simply. Because you understand that people are complicated, that they deserve a chance at redemption even when they don't deserve forgiveness. He climbed into his vehicle and drove away, leaving Sienna standing alone with a decision to make. 3 hours later, Sienna walked through the sterile hallways of Walter Reed Medical Center. She'd changed into civilian clothes, pulled her hair back, wore sunglasses that hid her eyes. Anonymous, forgettable, the way she preferred it. Voss was in a private room on the 4th floor. A military police officer sat outside the door checking IDs. Sienna showed her credentials, the ones that identified her as a federal agent, with clearances that made the MP straighten involuntarily. The officer knocked once, then opened the door. Voss looked smaller in the hospital bed. Older, the silver hair seemed thinner. The broad shoulders diminished under a hospital gown. Monitors beeped steadily. An IV dripped clear fluid into his arm. He looked up when Sienna entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You came, he said finally. His voice was hoarse, weakened. Sterling said you wanted to talk. Voss gestured weakly toward a chair. Sienna remained standing. I'm sorry, Voss said. The words came out flat, exhausted. For what I did on that parade ground, for letting my ego override my judgment, he trailed off, for making it personal when it should have been professional. Sienna finished for him. Voss nodded slowly. I knew something was off about you, the way you carried yourself, the way you deflected questions. I should have gone through proper channels, filed an inquiry, followed protocol. He coughed, winced at the pain in his chest. But I was angry. You made me feel small every time you politely refused my suggestions. Every time you demonstrated competence I couldn't match. Every time you reminded me that rank and ability aren't the same thing. Sienna crossed her arms. So you decided to destroy me publicly. Yes, Voss admitted, and I destroyed myself instead. He looked at her directly now. They told me what you were doing, not all of it, but enough, that you were running a counterintelligence operation, that you'd been tracking Reeves for 6 months, that your mission led to the arrest of 2 traitors who'd gotten Americans killed. His hands trembled slightly, and I nearly compromised that mission because my feelings were hurt. Sienna was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled the chair closer and sat down. Colonel, she said, her voice softer now, you spent 30 years serving this country. You led men in combat. You earned your rank through years of experience and sacrifice. One mistake doesn't erase that. Voss's eyes glistened. Doesn't it? My career is over. My reputation destroyed. I'll be remembered as the colonel who tried to humiliate a CIA operative because he couldn't handle being told no. You'll be remembered, Sienna said carefully, as a decorated officer who made a serious mistake under pressure and took responsibility for it. She leaned forward slightly. What you did was wrong. It was petty, vindictive, and it could have jeopardized lives. But you're not Nathan Reeves. You didn't betray your country for money. You didn't get people killed for personal gain. You let your ego cloud your judgment. That's human. It's wrong, but it's human. Voss wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. The congressional hearings start next week, he said. They're going to ask how a counterintelligence operation was nearly exposed by a base commander who couldn't control his personal feelings. I'm going to have to testify about what I did, why I did it. He looked at her. I'm going to tell them the truth, that I abused my authority, that I let personal animosity override professional judgment, that I endangered a classified operation because my pride was hurt. That's the right thing to do, Sienna said. Will you, Voss hesitated, will you testify? If they call me, yes, but I'll tell them the same thing I told those cadets, that you made a mistake, but that your 30 years of service shouldn't be defined only by your worst moment. Voss stared at her. Why would you do that after what I did to you? Sienna stood. Because I meant what I said on that parade ground. People are complicated. They're capable of both honor and pettiness. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is recognize that capacity for growth even in people who have hurt us. She walked toward the door, then paused. Colonel, you're going to lose your command. You'll probably face disciplinary action. Your career as you knew it is over. She turned back to look at him. But that doesn't mean your service has to end. There are veterans who need mentors, young officers who need guidance, programs that help soldiers transition to civilian life. You have 3 decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. Don't waste it wallowing in regret. Voss's throat worked as he tried to speak. Use what happened here to teach others, Sienna continued, about humility, about the difference between rank and leadership, about what happens when ego overrides judgment. Make your mistake mean something. She opened the door. And Colonel, thank you for your service. The real service. The 30 years before this. That matters too. She left before he could respond. Sterling was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his vehicle. He straightened when Sienna approached. How did it go? He apologized. He's going to testify honestly at the hearings. He's going to take full responsibility. Sterling nodded slowly. That took guts. Going to see him. It took remembering that we're supposed to be better than the worst things done to us, Sienna replied. She looked at Sterling. He's going to lose everything. His command, his reputation, maybe his pension if the investigation goes badly. That's the price of his mistake. I know, but I also know what it's like to live with consequences, to carry the weight of decisions that can't be undone. She paused. The difference is my decisions saved lives. His nearly cost them. But he's still a human being who served this country for 3 decades. He deserves a chance to rebuild, even if he doesn't deserve forgiveness. Sterling studied her face. You're more compassionate than most people in our line of work. Maybe, or maybe I just remember that the moment I stop seeing people as complicated, as capable of both good and bad, is the moment I become less effective at this job. She pulled out the envelope Sterling had given her earlier. 2 weeks mandatory leave. Where should I go? Sterling smiled slightly. Anywhere but a war zone. Anywhere with decent coffee and no encrypted phones. Anywhere you can sleep past 0600. That sounds like a fairy tale. Try anyway, because in 2 weeks you're going into a situation where you might not come back. I need you rested sharp and ready. Sienna nodded. I'll try. She climbed into her vehicle, started the engine, but before driving away she rolled down the window. Sir, those cadets on that parade ground, the ones who witnessed everything. What about them? They're going to remember this for the rest of their lives. The day they learned that authority and leadership aren't the same thing, that power can be abused, that real strength doesn't need applause. She paused. Some of them are going to make different choices because of what they saw. They're going to speak up when they witness injustice. They're going to think critically instead of following orders blindly. They're going to become the kind of leaders this country needs. Sterling nodded. That's the real victory here. Not catching Reeves, not exposing Hargrove, but planting seeds in 200 young minds about what service really means. Exactly, Sienna said. She drove away, leaving Fort Bragg behind her. In her rearview mirror, she watched the base shrink into the distance. Somewhere in that collection of buildings and parade grounds, 200 cadets were learning lessons they'd carry forever. And somewhere in a hospital room, a decorated colonel was facing the consequences of his choices and maybe, just maybe, finding a path toward redemption. The world kept turning, threats kept emerging, and in 2 weeks, Sienna Blackwell would disappear into the shadows again, operating in places that didn't exist, making decisions that would never be recorded, serving in silence the way she always had. But for now, for these 2 weeks, she would try to rest. Try to sleep without checking exits and windows. Try to eat a meal without calculating threat vectors. Try to be, for just a moment, something other than a weapon the government aimed at problems too dangerous for conventional solutions. She drove north toward Montana, toward mountains and forests and the kind of quiet that existed before she learned what the world really looked like behind its comfortable lies. And as she drove, she thought about Marcus Webb and the other cadets, about the seeds planted, about the lessons learned, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the most important mission she'd ever completed wasn't the ones that prevented disasters. It was the one that taught 200 young soldiers that honor wasn't something you wore on your uniform. It was something you earned by doing the right thing even when no one was watching, even when it cost you everything, even when the world never knew your name. That was the lesson of Fort Bragg. And it was a lesson worth the price.